Right, costing and pricing your work. I mean, everyone has their own way of charging, and all I can describe is the way that I've evolved over the years. Typically, the client will either email me or phone me up asking if I could do some pargeting for them. And we have a discussion, and I ask them to send me some visual information. Like, what I want to see is a straight on picture of the elevation of the building which is to be pargeted, so that I've got something that I can do design onto, and also a close-up of the area so that I can see what the substrate is that I'll be working onto. If they haven't got that, they might have architect's drawings. That will do perfectly well. But it's important very quickly to get them to send something to me, because it's far too easy for the pargeter to put a lot of effort into having ideas, being creative, and then, oh no, I think we'll have it done next year. So make them do the first bit of work and put in the first bit of legwork. That way, that weeds out the people who just think it would be a nice idea from those who are actually serious. And then, depending on the size of the job, the complexity of the job, how far away it is, I might then go to site and talk to the clients. And it varies whether I cover the cost of that or whether they do. Depends a bit how confident I feel that the job will actually happen. Otherwise, I will charge a fee at my normal hourly rate plus travel costs, and including cost of the time travelling. And then when I arrive on site, I have a chat with them, and I might wave around some pictures, or they show me some pictures, and they talk about the sort of thing that they want. As much information as, in a sort of a vague way as possible in both directions, except that you must never, ever, ever let the client persuade you to give them a price. Even an approximate price, do not do it. I have always regretted it whenever I do. What you say is, no, I will go away and have a think about it, and I will send you an email. And then you can go away and you can think about how far away it is, because there are lots of things that will make the cost vary. It's not a bog standard price for a parget at all. What I'll then do is go away and do some sort of preliminary sketches onto an overlay, onto the photograph that they've given me. This is unpaid work, so I've got to be pretty sure that the parget work is likely to materialise. Sometimes it's wasted work, but so long as you're reasonably confident, it's worth doing some drawings, because at that point you start to decide how complex the parget is going to be, how big it's going to be, that sort of thing, and that all goes into the costing. And then I sort of send a copy of the sketches and my outline costing to the client for approval, and it'll be a ballpark price at this time, and then that gives them an opportunity to say, God, I thought it was going to be half that price, or to say, yes, let's carry on talking. Pargeting is something that your client is unlikely to be familiar with, so it's important to sort of spell out in a formal written document what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and how it's going to happen. And if I'm doing combed and stamped work, that's fairly well defined, because you've got so many panels covering so much area, and so I can do that on a day rate. And I estimate how many days it will take once I've done the sketch. Bear in mind, you might have to come back to site to tend it. That's got to be included. And also site visits to chat to the client have to be included as well. If it's a large job, then I get the client to pay me every 2 weeks in instalments. So there are lots of things to consider when you're pricing your job, and I have a list of them here, the ones I've come up with. Scaffolding, and I always get either the client or their builder to pay for that directly. It's really expensive compared to the cost of pargeting, and I really do not need that cost running through my business. The scaffolding is always at the wrong height, but try and get the best you can. What you really want to aim at is you want a nice little seat to sit on, like a little bench, and you want to be pargeting just here. That's the most comfortable way to sit. It won't happen, but you really don't want to be you try and avoid pargeting behind the scaffold. So if this were the scaffold, pargeting in this gap behind the scaffold, because it's really inconvenient. If you have to stand up and even stand on your stool, that's fine. But behind the scaffold is a pig. So as much as you can, avoid that. So talk to the client and talk to the scaffolder about where you want the scaffold. So another thing is, what are you going to be pargeting onto? If the wall needs rebuilding, repairing, who's going to do it? Are you going to do it? In this case, you cost for it. If not, talk to the builder and tell them what finish you want them to leave for your pargeting. And I tend to leave it at scratch coat, undercoat position. Sometimes, other times I'll get them to put, if they've got a good plaster on site, I'll get them to plaster right over, and then I'll cut back into that plaster when I come to parget. It varies. The cost of the plaster, for small quantities, I provide it. If I'm doing a freehand design, this sort of size, I'll bring the plaster to site with me. If it's whole walls, that's a different matter. And so that will have to be costed in. I don't anymore do large areas, but when I did, I would tend to get the client to pay for that directly, because I don't want all this cash flow going through my business. I don't want to pay VAT. I've never wanted to pay VAT, and cash flow is what VAT is based on. So what you may well be doing is working in tandem with a flatwork plasterer, and it's good to build up a relationship with someone that you work well with, because then they know what you want and you know what they do, and then it's confident. And quite often I'll recommend a plasterer to a client. So another thing that makes the price vary is the climate. Worst case scenarios are things like a south-facing wall, high up, exposed to the wind, in the middle of a baking hot July. Oh God, try and avoid it. Try and shuffle your work around so that you do gable ends, south-facing gable ends in the spring or the autumn. If you can't, you're going to have to cost in things like making sure you've got protection, like cover it in hessian and spray it down regularly. That all adds to the cost. So you can usually juggle your work a bit so that there's not too much overhead, but it does need thinking about. The thing that really adds to the cost is if the client is determined for you to do outdoor work in the middle of winter, when there's any risk of frost at all. So you're talking from possibly mid-October, end of October, through to sort of towards the end of April. During that time, you could easily get frost, and you have to be prepared for it, because if your plaster gets frosted while it's setting, it will fail. And that will be down to you at that point. So you do have to say, if you want it in the middle of winter, you're going to have to pay. It's going to have to be protected. That does add lots to the cost. Don't do it if you can avoid it. Another thing that makes the cost vary is what sort of site you're working on. If you're working on something that's an active building site, then it's actually a lot easier than if you're working somewhere like, doing something high up in the client's house where you've got to clear everything away at the end of the day because they're going to use the space in the evening. It's a bit of a pig, that, and you really want to try and avoid it if you can, because you can't always avoid it, but it does cost, because you've got to keep the place spotless clean if it's in someone's house, and that is time and effort. If your work is high up on a scaffold, that adds to the cost as well, because you'll be going up and down on the scaffold several times a day, and that is hard work. Actually, going up and down a scaffold a lot. It's good physical workout, but it also adds to the time of doing the work. So think about that. It doesn't add lots, but it does add some. And then you've got to think about what happens when you finish the parget. Someone has got to spray down the work for a couple of days. They've got to take down any protective hessian you've put up. They've got to lime wash the parget. Is that you? In which case you can cost it in. If it isn't, then someone else has to do it. And spraying down is not very hard to teach someone if there's someone on site. Quite often it's the client, or maybe it's their builder. They'll do it for a couple of days, and twice a day for a couple of days, and then once a day for a week perhaps. Taking down the Hessian isn't particularly tricky. Lime washing is not, well, it's not rocket science, but it's not trivial. And if you're not doing it yourself and the person who's going to do it is not experienced, you're going to have to train them up as to how to do it. So that's something to think about. With experience, you can spot difficult clients a long way off. They're difficult on day one, they'll be difficult throughout. They can be expensive, and I have been known to put in a price that is extremely high to try and put them off. And if it doesn't put them off, then I've made a lot of money. And once or twice I have just turned down jobs because I think, nah, that's going to be trouble. Most clients are lovely. I have to say 99% of my clients are sweetie boxers, but there are the odd ones and you have to be aware of them. Vehicle costs. I don't like driving much. I don't do it for fun. So what I do is I charge my hourly rate for all the time it takes me to drive from home to the client and back again. You may or may not do that, depending on how much you like driving, I suppose. And of course, then I also charge a fee for how much it costs to run the vehicle. And I suppose the last thing is staying away from home. Most jobs are local and it's not relevant, but from time to time it is, and in which case I'll have to add in a cost for an Airbnb. Occasionally I'll stay with the client. It depends on the client. Quite a few of my clients have got big houses and they might have a little annex, or they might be real nice people that I stay with. But quite often it will be an Airbnb type place, and then I'll charge for an evening meal. The other problem with pargeting is it tends to be seasonal. Most of the work is outdoors, and really you could do with having another trade to keep you busy in the winter. Someone suggested being a ski instructor would be perfect. Most pargeters also work as plasterers, so they can do indoor plaster work during the winter. I do property development, but you do need something. I think that's the costs, really. I think we're there.